last video, we talked about idea trees and ideas that once they're started become entrenched, and how occasionally you want to revisit those ideas to ask yourself if you need to grow a new trunk. But there's sometimes that ideas don't need to be revisited, but they still do. And that is called the reinvention fallacy. So have you ever had someone who didn't fully understand something why the way it was, and they just wanted to rebuild it? But the act of rebuilding it helps them understand it. And so they end up building something similar. I remember when I was a business analyst, I would oftentimes be asked to go build something. And in the act of building it, I would sometimes discover that it had already been built or something like it in the past. I called that like an archeological dig. So when this new solution gets made, it solves that initial problem of kind of understanding how the system works, but it's temporary because the next person or group to come along is just going to have the same problem. They either need to learn it and use it, or they choose to rebuild it. So if the first person or group had just learned or kept the original system, it wouldn't have had to been rebuilt. So that's what we call the reinvention fallacy. So it's the act of reinventing something to understand it, which can often take the same amount of effort or more. This is because they either won't take the time to learn it, or they have some sort of bias against it, that if they don't understand the system, it must be wrong. This can even happen in relationships. You're with someone and you think, oh, this isn't working out, I just need to go get a new system, when the grass isn't always greener. So here are a few cognitive biases and psychological tendencies that explain why this happens. Egocentric bias. This is the assumption that because you don't understand something, it must be flawed or poorly designed. This bias leads to dismissing the value of existing systems in favor of creating new ones. Like, this marriage isn't working, let's go start a new one. Or Dropbox isn't working, let's get Google Drive instead. Maybe that'll be better. Not invented here syndrome, or NIH syndrome. That's a tendency to distrust or undervalue solutions or systems created by others, and instead prioritize rebuilding or creating something from scratch, even if the existing solution is adequate. So if you work somewhere and some new executive comes in and they're like, why are we using this old CMS? We need to use Salesforce. That's the not invented here syndrome. Curse of knowledge, or inverse. This occurs when someone lacking knowledge assumes the system is over complex or broken, rather than recognizing their own learning gap. So we'll talk about this later in the simplicity paradox, but it's essentially like a depth of simplicity problem where they don't understand why it is and they're not taking the effort to understand it. They'd rather just replace it, and the act of replacing it gets them that understanding. Action bias is a preference for taking action, such as rebuilding a system or getting remarried, over inaction, learning the existing one, or learning how to be a good partner, respectively. So even if action isn't necessarily the optimal solution, this bias can create a false sense of productivity because at least they're doing something. We'll talk about later, this is kind of similar to the trial and error heuristic. The Dunning-Kruger effect is where in the early stages of something, someone might assume that something is easy, but once they get into it, they realize, oh no, this is really complex. Now this can help you if you're starting a big project and you're scared of it, like you don't know what you don't know. So, but once you get into it just enough, you realize the trough of despair ahead of you, that you've embarked on something that's much more complex than you really originally understood. And then reinvention bias this is kind of like I was alluding to before, where the grass is always greener tendency to favor starting over rather than just learning or adapting to what's already there. And this is driven by the mistaken belief that rebuilding will lead to a better outcome or a deeper understanding, which it could, and it definitely leads to a deeper understanding, but it may need not have happened. So that's the reinvention fallacy. But what happens when an idea is just getting started? So we've talked about the idea tree, we've talked about, which is about entrenched ideas and occasionally revisiting them. We talked about this kind of reinvention fallacy, where you think like you have to take an entrenched idea and reinvent it. But what happens when an idea is first getting started? So in the next couple of videos, I'm going to be covering a few things that happen when you try to explain an idea or get it across and it's initially rejected. And we'll talk about a couple of different reasons why and what you can do about it.